In the second video, we're going to be taking a look at connective tissue slides that you're studying in lab this week. So to begin with, we're looking at areolar connective tissue, sometimes called loose areolar connective tissue, because this is going to denote it from the different dense types of connective tissue that we will also study in the lab. So areolar connective tissue is a great place to start because it shows you a number of factors that we're going to see in most connective tissue types. So to begin with right here, connective tissue differs pretty heavily from epithelial tissue in that there's a lot of space between the cells which are found in the type of connective tissue we're looking at. In epithelial tissue, the cells were pretty closely packed together. In addition to that, with epithelial tissue, we tend to focus just on the cells that are there because they make up the majority of the tissue itself. But with connective tissue, there's a number of fiber types as well as cells that we study. So to begin with, as we look at this kind of areolar connective tissue, the predominant cell type we see here is called a fibroblast. It's named because it's going to be producing some of the many protein fibers that are strewn throughout the tissue. So when you take a look at the fibroblast itself, what stands out most is the nucleus. Much like we saw with epithelial cells, that nucleus stains pretty dark. It's a nice round or an oval-shaped nucleus. And then the cytoplasm stains in addition to that. And when you see this, it's a nice elongated cell. You can also see this nice elongated fibroblast down here. Of course, again, the nucleus denotes where that cell would sit. And as you can see here, these cells are not closely packed together. Lots of space between them. Now that space in itself is called the extracellular matrix, filled with a number of things, including lots of water. And then as you can see here, fibers. So these protein fibers themselves, there tend to be three types we look at in connective tissues. We can see two of those types here. Collagen fibers are pretty easy to spot. They are these pink or light purple fibers that you see all throughout the tissue. They're going to provide a lot of strength and resilience. We're going to see them all throughout connective tissues. So just keep a note here that these are these pink tissues or these pink fibers, giving a tissue this pink color under the microscope. And then, of course, we have elastic fibers. Here they are stained black, and elastic fibers tend to give you that ability to stretch and recoil as a tissue. So there's two slides you'll look at in lab, one that's just known as loose areolar connective tissue, and another that is just titled mast cells. And this is because it's still a section of areolar connective tissue, but an additional stain has been added so that you can see mast cells. It's a type of immune cell. This cell has a nucleus like the cells we've been looking at, and within its cytoplasm it has a bunch of smaller granules which release chemicals associated with the inflammatory response. Now this is different from your fibroblasts. So your fibroblast nuclei would still stain dark, but there are no granules around it. And so this is a great example of a mast cell right here. Again, you are likely going to find mast cells in any type of areolar connective tissue you're looking for, but a special stain has to be added for you to see them. So this just give you an indication that this areolar connective tissue can house many different cell types, including those that are associated with the immune response. Now, of course, we already looked at keratinized stratified squamous epithelium when we were discussing epithelial slides, but I wanted to bring it back up here to show you that when studying the skin, you see a location of areolar connective tissue, and that's right here in this papillary layer of the dermis. So this actually is a great location. Loose areolar connective tissue houses blood vessels, the ducts of glands. So again, really good location to note as far as where loose areolar connective tissue would be found. Another type of connective tissue is adipose connective tissue, otherwise known as fat, but this is going to be comprised of adipocytes. Of course, these are fat cells, but we want to stick with the more technical name. And these cells are pretty identifiable. So you recognize them usually as bubbles is what people will see, or eyeballs. So that's a good example right here with this nice dark nucleus that looks kind of like a pupil. So these adipose cells have cytoplasm as well as an inclusion that's going to contain basically an oil droplet. So adipose connective tissue is an excellent energy storage tissue, and that's what you would find inside of these cells are triglycerides, right, or a type a type of fat that's really great at releasing energy as it's broken down. Reticular connective tissue. This is named for the high number of reticular fibers that we would see. So, of course, we've looked at elastic fibers and collagen fibers. Reticular fibers themselves are the third type of fibers that we look for in connective tissue. And while they're found in most connective tissues, reticular connective tissue is so named because this is where they're the most numerous. So once again, these fibers are produced by fibroblasts. Sometimes these are referred to as reticular cells, not reticulocytes. That's going to be a completely different cell. But these fibroblasts, again, with the dark nuclei, producing these cells. You'll find a lot of spaces, once again, in reticular connective tissue, and a number of things can be housed there. You'll oftentimes find blood vessels located within this tissue. Because of the reticular fibers and the strength that they have, they're really great for providing a framework for blood vessels and for nerves. So you tend to see these forming the skeleton or the framework. We'll also call it a stroma for organs that are associated with the lymphatic system. So, for example, lymph nodes. Then we move into our dense connective tissues. With the loose connective tissues, all the fibers that we saw had space between them. So if you go back and you look at your areolar connective tissue, your adipose connective tissue, even the reticular tissue a few minutes ago, there's space between all those extracellular fibers. But here as we move into dense connective tissues, you can see that the fibers themselves are more closely packed together. And so the fiber type most predominant here is collagen, and that's the pink that you see. Of course, you have to have fibroblasts producing that, and you can see those flattened dark nuclei here. They just show up pretty well there. You see some more here and here all through the slide. And those are producing those collagen fibers. What makes this regular is that those collagen fibers are running parallel to one another. So they're making these nice waves all the way throughout this particular tissue or organ itself. So this is what you're going to find in elongated tissues like tendons that produce a lot of strength but pulling in one direction essentially. Now, when you look at dense irregular connective tissue, its counterpart, if you will, you get the same idea. You're going to see densely packed collagen fibers, but these collagen fibers don't sit parallel to one another. The best place to see that is to once again pull up your thick skin slide and take a look at the reticular layer of the dermis. So the reticular layer of the dermis has thick bands of collagen fibers, and that's the pink that you're going to see all down here within the dermis, but you don't see that characteristic wave-like appearance where all the collagen fibers are stacked together. And so this cannot be dense regular connective tissue. This is going to be dense irregular. The fibers are all running in different directions. The next kind of elastic connective tissue we look at is elastic connective tissue, so named for the elastic fibers that are present. What we're looking at in lab is a slide that's a cross-section of the aorta, so one of the largest blood vessels in the body. And the aorta itself has to have strength, but it also has to have a great deal of elasticity. So as it fills with blood and it stretches, it then has to be able to recoil and close itself back down with its smallest diameter to maintain appropriate blood pressure. And just like a rubber band does that, it stretches and recoils, so do elastic fibers. And so these black waves that you see all through here are just bundles of elastic fibers, creating the elasticity of the wall of the aorta. So elastic connective tissue here. Zoomed in at 400x magnification, you see those nice thick elastic fibers. So very unique look compared to other types of tissues. Now, it's important that you not confuse elastic connective tissue with elastic cartilage connective tissue, which we will see in a minute. Hyaline cartilage is going to be the first of the three types of cartilage that we look at. Now, these are still referred to as connective tissues because the majority of what you see here is extracellular matrix. So let's take a look here at the boundaries of hyaline cartilage. This outer section is referred to as the perichondrium, literally meaning around the cartilage. Think of it as like the crust of bread. It's the crust or the outer ridge of the cartilage itself. Now, the cell type that you look for within hyaline cartilage and all cartilage is referred to as a chondrocyte, so a cartilage cell. Now, as you can see right here, those have a great deal of space between them. What you can see are the dark nuclei of the chondrocytes. So we're going to zoom in to take a better look at these. These chondrocytes right here are all inside of little cavities referred to as lacunae, right? Or a lacuna, which would be singular. These are essentially what I like to think of as little swimming pools that have a chondrocyte within them. And of course, a great deal of extracellular matrix between those chondrocytes and lacuna. And this happens to be filled with collagen fibers. And that's why this tissue has this pink appearance when stained and looked at under the microscope. We also have elastic cartilage connective tissue. Again, don't confuse this with elastic tissue as was found in the aorta. However, they get their name from the same reason. Elastic cartilage connective tissue has abundance of elastic fibers here between the chondrocytes and lacunae. So if we zoom in, you can see the perichondrium here at the very top. You'd find it on all sides there of the elastic cartilage. And then here is a lacuna with a chondrocyte within it. And then, of course, the space between neighboring lacunae, right, that would be your matrix. Pretty densely packed elastin fibers right there between the lacunae. And the last kind of cartilage we look at is fibrocartilage connective tissue. So the idea here is that fibrocartilage is the only one of the three types that will not always have a perichondrium. So this particular location where this slide was taken from, you won't see perichondrium. This is what's found in the pubic symphysis, where you have two regions of bone that are joined by fibrocartilage. So this is a strip of fibrocartilage right down the middle, and these are regions of bone on either side. So as we zoom in a little bit closer here, here's that fibrocartilage. Once again, it looks a lot like hyaline cartilage, so it's pink because there's a lot of collagen fibers. You're going to see chondrocytes and lacunae. And then right over here, right adjacent to it, you're going to see regions of bone. Right? And notice there's no perichondrium between the two. And so this will be one of the ways that you recognize fibrocartilage as compared to hyaline cartilage. So that bone that we were looking at, we're actually going to spend some time identifying on its own. There's two types of bone tissue we study. We're looking at spongy bone, also called cancellous bone, as well as compact bone. So spongy bone gets its name because it does look like a sponge. You're going to see pretty densely packed regions here of collagen. And then in between those, you're going to see big open spaces where bone marrow is found. So these regions right here that are more densely packed are called trabeculae. Right? And these are basically formed as collagen fibers pack pretty tightly together around bone cells. So if we zoom in and take a closer look at that, these trabeculae right here actually look a little bit like cartilage. And that's because there are actually regions of bone in the body that are formed directly from cartilage. It's not true in all cases, but they have a lot of similarities. And so you can see those similarities here when you look at this tissue. Here's the regions of bone marrow around that. And you'll notice, of course, there's some adipocytes that are present within the bone marrow. So if we look a little bit closer, there's a few cell types that I want you to see. So to begin with right here, you see those lacunae, which are very similar to what we saw in cartilage, only now the type of cell inside is not a chondrocyte. Here you're looking at an osteocyte, so a bone cell. So those bone cells are trapped in these lacunae, and these are actually going to be more hardened than what you would see in cartilage. On the outer region here of this trabecula, you're going to see what's referred to as endosteum. Right? And endosteum is going to be important for formation of bone. And then, of course, you see these cells that are associated with bone marrow itself. Those are hematopoietic cells. And those cells themselves have the ability to form components of blood, not just red blood cells, but also white blood cells. And then, of course, these nice bubble-shaped adipocytes within the bone marrow. So that spongy appearance right there for cancellous bone, very different from what you see with compact bone. So there are not big air pockets or spaces, and they're not true air pockets, of course, they just look like them. But you don't see that here in compact bone. Instead, you see what looks like records or tree rings. So the idea is with compact bone tissue, you have a functional unit known as an osteon. And this is composed of a central canal, right, also called a Haversian canal, with encircling rings known as lamellae, right, or a single lamella would be one ring. And as we zoom into those, that's where you find the osteocytes in this slide, so those bone cells. Now, these are going to be housed in lacunae, but you can't see those quite as well as you can in spongy bone. But nonetheless, you can see them denoted right there, picking up a darker stain. So they tend to arrange themselves on those lamellae, so in that nice circular pattern. And each one of them has these tiny tubules which run off the sides, and they're referred to as canaliculi. And these are going to be important for the absorption and deposit of nutrients, as well as chemical signals between neighboring bone cells. And so that's compact bone. The last type of connective tissue we study is blood. And you oftentimes won't think of this as tissue itself, but it has all the hallmarks of it. So you have cells, which are spread apart with space between. And then, of course, that space is going to house a number of things, including nutrients, cellular fragments, fluid. It's the perfect example of extracellular matrix. So the two biggest groups of cells that we see here are going to be erythrocytes, or red blood cells, and leukocytes, or white blood cells. You'll also find platelets, which come from a kind of a cell called a thrombocyte, and they're responsible for clotting. Now, the erythrocytes themselves are pretty unique as far as cell morphology goes, in that they do not have a nucleus, right? And so that's why you have what looks like a hollow center here. You don't have a darkly staining nucleus like you do in other cell types. Leukocytes even have nuclei, so you'll see the nuclei here actually picking up a nice purple stain. Right, so some of them are uninucleate, like what you would see right here. And then some of them have a nucleus that looks like it's divided into multiple lobes. You don't need to know the different types of leukocytes, but we will study them later on. And that is it as far as connective tissue goes.